You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. Hey folks, if you want to go right to the conversation, fast forward about 4.5 minutes, but I want to set the table for what you're about to hear. In this episode of the Braver Angels podcast, I spoke to mathematician and critic of anti-racism and left-wing identity-based politics and sociology generally, James Lindsay. In conventional terms, James' native political leanings are progressive. On the basis of economic policy, for instance, I'm not sure he would have a big problem with most of Bernie Sanders' agenda. He is one of a growing number of disaffected liberals or progressives who find themselves out of step with the progressive mainstream. But he in particular has become a lightning rod of contempt in the digital space for his provocative and combative ways of engaging his opponents. I think that James has lost friendships over his style and approach, and for the turn in his politics. While I don't know that his previous views on the traditional left-right questions on the role of government have changed, he is so convinced that anti-racism and leftist ideology are the biggest threats to American society that he, as an otherwise left-leaning independent, was willing to cast his vote for Donald Trump. Some of the things that he says are interpreted by some of his critics as being racist, though I don't necessarily share that interpretation. But for that, among other reasons, he is persona non grata among not only his predictable enemies, but even some of his former allies, and I don't pretend to be acquainted with everything that he has tweeted in the past that has given people cause for concern. We did not talk about these things in this conversation, at least not much. One thing I will say, and do allude to in this episode, is that while I would not say that James and I were friends before this conversation, we've only had one short and casual dialogue previously, and that was months ago, he and I do share mutual friends whom I value. That would not stop me from seeking in the Braver Angels way to challenge James on any issue of importance. To James's credit, I think he would be willing to come back on and discuss any of his previous controversies, and I do in fact plan on asking him to return to this program for precisely that purpose. But when I announced on social media that I would be talking to Lindsay, I heard not merely from critics but from friends and well-wishers that to talk to James is to risk my own credibility and that of the organization I represent, Braver Angels. We've been getting a lot of that lately, given our decision to hold a debate on the 2020 election. If you're listening to this podcast on the day it was released, by the way, you still have time to attend. Go to braverangels.org and check out our upcoming events page to learn more. But the tragedy in all of this is that James actually has strong arguments to make in support of his views. And that is why he has a following that has continued to grow and grow significantly in the digital space, in spite of the shaming that, fairly or unfairly, is heaped upon him. As I said, on another occasion I'd intend to engage James on his style. For indeed, style is substance, in my view, so I don't wish to trivialize the matter. But there was an intellectual conversation to be had here on anti-racism, the teachings of Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, on race in America and the black and white experience that had to be had. And I'm very glad we had it. This was a long conversation, though fans of James will be used to his long dialogues. James does almost all of the talking over the first 35 minutes. I then proceed to do almost all of the talking for the next 35. We don't get into much of a back and forth until well over an hour into the conversation, so you're going to want to buckle up for this one. James and I share a deep belief in the importance of worldview and philosophy and systems of thought in explaining our social realities. I wanted to give him the opportunity to fully share the depth of his thinking with respect to anti-racism without interruption from me. I then in turn offered my view. I think you will find that James's view of this subject and mine managed to be both very similar and yet very different at precisely the same time. If you are interested in the subject of anti-racism and race in America more broadly, you may find that this is a definitive conversation. I at least am proud of it and think that there is no subject in America more worthy of our attention. I hope you find value in it too. My thanks to James Lindsay for joining us. And I am joined by Mr. James Lindsay. James will be familiar to many folks listening to this podcast. For those for whom he is not particularly familiar, I'll say about him very quick that he is a mathematician by training. He is a person who has been associated in the past along with Peter Boghossian, who is a former guest of this podcast, and Helen Pluckrose, as the authors of the now I want to say grievance studies papers, but then again, that may be a bit too colloquial a reference. James, what's the proper way to refer to those documents?
Well, that is the name that was given to them. And there were two names given, that and Sokol squared, which I think is a bit of a misnomer. Yasha
Mm,
Monk, our friend Yasha, gave it that name. I
mm,
think it's a bit of a misnomer. So the Grievance Studies Affair is actually the name of what happened. So I guess those documents would be that. We usually refer to it as the project,
mm.
or
Okay.
because that's what our secret code name. We were so creative, as you can imagine. Yeah, that was our secret code name for it, the project. And or we call them our fake papers. I mean, we don't have a better name. Grievance Studies
Okay.
was the name that we attached to it.
Okay.
We thought we made it up, but it turns out somebody had beaten us to that term.
Mm,
About 20 years earlier, it showed up in the English literature from Stefan Collini, had actually mentioned it in the same context, meaning the same thing, a
gotcha.
particular approach to cultural studies that he outlined in a chapter of a book
Mm,
and mentioned it once.
okay. So, author of the Grievance Studies papers, and I'll have you say a little bit about that in just a second, as just as a little bit more window dressing and context in terms of who you are. Along with Peter, you also co-authored a book, which we discussed with Peter on this podcast, and that some Braver Angels members will certainly be familiar with. How to Have Impossible Conversations. That'll tip a little bit into some of what we'll talk about in this conversation here, because it's certainly an area of mutual interest, yourself and myself. James, you also participated in one of our Braver Angels debates during our Braver Angels campaign last year, I think, on the subject of cancel culture. And I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
remember. I think that we had Andrew Sullivan, maybe Hawk Newsom was in
Both,
that
yeah.
event, and
Andrew Sullivan, Hawk Newsom, John Roush stand out. Ines Stepman was in there.
that's right, that's right.
Yeah.
Ken Bone, maybe, yeah,
Ken Bone was there. That's right.
Charlotte Clymer. So folks in the Brave Rangers community will be many folks will be familiar with you, certainly, and folks outside of it, because you are a person with a strong following. It seems to me that your following has really sort of spiked over the course of I don't know, the last several months. I think even since we had you in that event. And I guess for a couple of reasons. Part of it is that you have become a very visible critic of anti-racism, and I guess the application of anti-racism in public administration, in university, corporate, and other institutional cultural settings. And so anti-racism is a big part of what I want to discuss with you today. But is there anything else that you credit or blame your surge in, I guess, both popularity and infamy? Because I mean, I
Right.
guess to be honest, it's both, right? At this
Right.
point,
Yeah, it is. It is.
yeah. What do you credit the rise in your visibility to?
Okay. So, I mean, I can kind of track when there have been bursts in that based on I mean, it's a poor metric. It's not an ideal metric, but my Twitter follower count has
Mm-hmm.
been helpful to kind of gauge when something must be happening. And so when the grievance studies affair dropped in October of 2018, I remember I had 11,000 followers on Twitter. That quickly jumped up to the high 20s, and crept from there.
And give people, since I said that you would, give people just a
Uh-huh.
very quick, I know it's hard, quick synopsis of what the grievance studies papers actually were.
Yeah, so the goal we had with that was to see if we could hoax the academic literature in what's kind of broadly known as the theoretical humanities, stuff like gender studies, kind of dipping into education and sociology, critical race theory, these kinds of journals, intersectional feminism. And we wanted to see if we could write academic hoaxes in the vein of the infamous or famous, I suppose, Alan Sokol from 1996, where he hoaxed
Mm-hmm.
a postmodern social commentary journal with a silly paper saying that gravity doesn't exist.
Okay.
And they fell for it. And we definitively figured out that whether or not it's possible to hoax those journals, we did not possess the skill to do so. We did not successfully hoax them in our hoax attempts. So then we decided to try to answer the question, what's going on there? Because we're pretty sure something's wrong here. So can we publish not hoaxes, but outright sophistry? And we ended up getting, in a few months, we ended up writing 14 more papers, 20 in total, 6 hoaxes that all failed, 20 papers total. So 14 sophistry papers where we started with our conclusion, worked backwards, tried to make them ridiculous or broken in some way, like the logic doesn't flow, intentional non sequitur, something like that. And 7 of those, before the Wall Street Journal caught us in public, made us public before we were ready, 7 of them were accepted. 7 more were still under peer review. A sociologist argued that either 11 or 12 of them, probably out of those 14, would have been accepted. So we thought we had showed and had hoped to show that A, you can't hoax them. In other words, these people do know what they're talking about. And B, what they're producing is sophistry that can be demonstrated by producing more sophistry with the volume turned up and sent back to them.
Right.
And so that's what that was about.
Right. So you sort of jumped onto the scene, so to speak, in a way that just sort of immediately pinned you as a controversial figure. Because on the one hand, these grievance studies papers seem to confirm for many folks what many people had already sort of suspected or felt like they knew, which is that, academic publications in the humanities, and perhaps just the culture of academia and the humanities in particular, is subject to a way of interacting with the world that has nothing to do with logical rigor or empirical truth and everything to do with social agendas and ideologies. You had other folks who at the time, I think, made the point that somehow or other your getting these papers published didn't necessarily indicate what you thought it did, or that even if the point that you were trying to make was legitimate, you went about it in a way that was damaging or destructive. I recall that sort of chatter. So that was early 2018, but you've become much more visible since then. So bring us up to the current.
So that crept up. So using the Twitter follower count, that was 11,000. That crept me up to about 30,000 over the ensuing, maybe 6 months or so. That included a Rogan appearance. That included, talking to some high profile outlets, obviously. And then I think that just kind of continued to slowly rise over the spring. I launched my company, New Discourses, in would have been, I guess, the end of February last year. And it crept up from then until May from about 30 to 35 to about 50,000. So it's just this kind of creeping growth because I'm saying things, I'm publishing things, I'm putting things out there that are hitting people where something is. And then all of a sudden, George Floyd died.
Yeah.
And I went from 60,000 followers to 80,000 or 50,000, I should say, to 80,000 in a few weeks. It went very quickly. And then I went on Joe Rogan. And then that doubled. I went to like 150,000 in like a month. So going on Joe Rogan increases your follower count rather substantially is one lesson here. And from there, it's crept up again. It hasn't had any gigantic bursts of growth. The publication of Cynical Theories at the end of the summer last year, netted a handful. I think I gained a whopping 1,000 when Donald Trump retweeted me one time.
That's right. He did.
Yeah, that was entertaining. I said something completely sane and the president retweeted it. And then people got really mad at me and said I had to denounce the president or else I'm complicit in Nazism or something.
Sure.
And so I changed my handle on Twitter to retweeted by the president.
Right.
In defiance of that.
Okay.
So this is framing for probably other things you want to talk about, which is why I bring it up. So anyway, going on Joe Rogan though, and if you really want my opinion, speaking fairly unvarnished truth into something that people perceive as being crazy, the most common thing that people say to me is, I'm allowing them to realize that they themselves are not crazy, that the world is going crazy around them. And that seems to be the anchor point around which my popularity has grown the most, to be honest with you. And then going on Joe Rogan, I was, I think, pretty reasonable and sane the whole time I talked with Joe, forthright for 3 hours with him, not too animated, not too ridiculous. I tend to interview down from my Twitter behavior, if you will. And like I said, that was overwhelmingly the largest segment of growth. It probably helped that Twitter temporarily banned me for no reason, literally no reason at all, while I was writing an essay about exclusion.
Well,
I came back checking my edits on my own essay about exclusion, and then I noticed that Twitter had excluded me. It was kind of funny, just the way that coincidence worked out.
Yeah.
But that hit right after I hit 2 million views on Rogan. Maybe that's a coincidence. They said there was suspicious activity in my account. I'm assuming that growing by nearly 100,000 followers in a very short period of time is suspicious activity. But I don't know.
Right.
They never told me.
Well, I see the irony. But to draw back to something that you just said, you said that people people come to you and follow you because you are saying things that they are feeling, but the fact that you're saying them allows them to know that they're not crazy. So in other words, people are thinking things, they have opinions, they have feelings about issues on the table that they don't want to express, that they're afraid to express perhaps, and they're doubting themselves and perhaps their own integrity because they feel like their views are unacceptable in their context. But then you say the things that other people are afraid to say, and that makes people feel like, okay, I'm not alone. Take me into what it is you are saying. I know that you're speaking on a range of subjects, and when I said that we were going to have you on the podcast, people peppered me with all sorts of things they want, me to ask you and hit you with, so on and so forth. We're not going to be able to cover it all in one conversation. Tell me in particular, what you've been saying about anti-racism. What is your take on it? What is your critique of it?
Okay, so my take on anti-racism. First of all, we got to understand the term
Mhm.
in what the everyday common parlance person would understand. I hope it's obvious that I am actually anti-racist.
Mhm.
I'm pretty much anti everything that's a bad way to go about it, right?
Mhm.
About anything. So my take is essentially that method matters. So you have these people who have come up with this particular theory about anti-racism, that about taking on racism. So let's just kind of like drop back with the language a little bit.
Mhm.
Challenging racism, addressing racism that's rooted in a theory called critical race theory, or to some degree, critical whiteness studies. These are academic, I use disciplines, but they're academic fields of study.
Right.
And I think that while they may possibly, and it varies from individual to individual, of course, but I would say the majority of these people are sincere and have good intentions, that their method is very bad.
Mhm.
And so what I'm primarily saying is there's a difference between the liberal approaches, universal liberal approaches to the United States civics is based upon, for example, that the Constitution was written to be eventually lived up to, but was not initially. There's an approach that looks like that, and then there's an approach that these new activists are pushing that is fundamentally different from that. And in fact, I would go further and say that it makes the same mistake that it claims to be trying to correct for.
Mhm.
I've colloquially pinned that as I call it the mistake of 1650, following a Kenyan friend of mine who said it to me on a phone call we had one day, which is to put social significance into racial categories intentionally.
Mhm.
And so it's for me a matter of method. I look, for example, and this is kind of the simplest critique. I think I have a podcast that like just started to come out for my Patreon subscribers like right now when we're having this conversation, where I
Nice.
talk about with Martin Luther King and his movement, the civil rights movement. We don't have to pin it on King, but
Mhm.
he subscribed to this. If you recall, and I know you've got roots in Tennessee, and there's a mural of this in Memphis.
Mhm.
The men marched, and I say men on purpose because it won't make sense if it's otherwise, but the men marched with placards, signs they held up that said, "I am a man."
Mhm.
Let's not pigeonhole me into a racial identity category. I'm like you.
Mhm.
We're the same. We're the same. Let's not pigeonhole us anymore. I am a man. And so then that's 1963, right? This big march in Memphis. I am a man. That's universal liberalism. That's Martin Luther King saying that the United States and the Constitution wrote a promissory note that it was not fulfilling to some of
Right.
its citizens. That's Frederick Douglass in 1852 or 3, whichever it was, with his Fourth of July speech. It's very famous, that came out on the 4th of July again this year, talking about how he loves the founding fathers, he loves the Declaration of Independence, he loves the Constitution, and we are cheating a huge population in this country by not extending it properly to them, and we have to live up to that.
Mhm.
That's universal liberalism. That's what I say, and we can talk about the details of color blindness if you want, but a largely colorblind approach. I am a man, not I am a black man. I am an Asian man. I am a Latino.
Mhm.
Um, Then you have Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the architects of critical race theory, the architect of intersectionality, writing in 1991 in a paper titled Mapping the Margins, which she drew heavily from other thinkers. I don't want to give her full blame or credit for this. Bell Hooks was saying similar stuff, another radical Black feminist activist in the 80s and 90s that was very prominent then. And she has this paragraph where she says that there's a fundamental difference between the statements, I am Black and I am a person who happens to be Black. And what she says is that the second of those statements, I'm a person that happens to be Black, puts universal humanity ahead of what she calls a socially imposed identity. So she says, here we are, we have King and his movement, 1960s, saying, stop socially imposing this identity on me, right? And then we have 30 years later, Kimberly Crenshaw writing, this identity is still socially imposed. So rather than asking you to stop, we're going to claim it as a site for politics, for doing identity politics. And this is where I say that mistake of 1650 gets made again. In 1650, you had white people make the mistake that they could start defining white and Black and saying Black is going to be inferior and we're going to put you on slave ships and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. We can colonize your land. We can say why you're inferior, blah, blah, blah. And it's racial. Mistake. Took us 3 centuries to start really over 3 centuries to really make progress on unmaking that mistake. And then here we have Miss Crenshaw and her coterie of other scholars coming along and saying, you know what? Here we are at the very end point of that, and it hasn't produced perfect results. So let's flip it back over. Let's do it backwards. And so for me, that's my critique, that the method gets it backwards. The method is wrong. And that's even without getting into there is no neutral. There's no such thing as not racist. There's only racist or anti-racist, which is a false dichotomy. So the logic of this thing is very, not just radical, but frankly, almost totalitarian. You're either with us or you're against us, right? There's no middle ground. There's no, and I don't mean neutral in the sense like I don't want to participate in the fight, but to say that there's no such thing as not being racist is just poisonous place to go, in my opinion.
Can you say a little bit about, so I hear your critique of the logic that is employed in this perspective, but can you say a little bit about where the problems with this analysis actually show up in our social reality in ways that you are concerned about, in ways that I would imagine you think that we all should be concerned about?
Oh, sure. I mean, for example, we see this curriculum being put into our school systems right now pretty prominently. So I worry about the kids. I hear from a lot of people who worry about their own kids. My kids are older. They're not in the school systems anymore, so I don't have to worry about that in that regard. But we see things happening where, for example, the students are separated by race. And they're told very different things about what that means. The white students are told about their privilege, and they're told to sit in their privilege and become uncomfortable about how that's complicit in these problems. And we're talking with very young children.
Right.
Meanwhile, the Black and Latino students, and by the way, the Asians and the Jews kind of get caught in this weird vortex, right, along this line. And some of the light-skinned Latinos. And maybe even some of the light-skinned Black, which can get really complicated. But then your Black and Latino students are put in another category and told how the white students are oppressing them and how whiteness in society is oppressing them. And maybe they don't mean to, but this is actually the reality. Because this critical race theory, if you read their own books, I should say, but I'm thinking of a particular book called Critical Race Theory, which is a kind of standard undergraduate level textbook for this. It's written by Richard Delgado, and who's been there from the beginning, and his partner Gene Stefanchik. When I say from the beginning, he was one of the very early scholars adopting this. They say that the primary assumption of critical race theory, the first assumption that it makes is that racism is the ordinary state of affairs in all social phenomena.
Right.
It's not an aberration. And of course, it's systemic. It's rooted in the system. And so your orientation against the system determines whether or not you are complicit with or against racism.
Can I ask you just a brief philosophical nerd question here? Is this assertion that racism is the default condition of human nature, or is it asserting that this is the default condition of Western society dating
Western society?
Okay.
Western society. Yeah, this is not They don't believe that human nature exists. So it's definitely not a claim about human nature. It's a claim about, if you read the very first paragraph of this book, for example, it tells you what its targets are, the things that it questions.
Mm.
The very first paragraph tells you that they question traditional approaches to civil rights. That would be your "I am a man"
Mm.
approach. They question that. They call it into question. They question the liberal order. They question equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and the neutral principles of constitutional law. So they're talking about a socio-political system
Right.
and a way of thinking when you get to Enlightenment rationalism and legal reasoning.
Understood.
Right. So it's not about people. It's not to say, oh, people have some inherent seed of seeing difference and trying to make hierarchies out of hierarchize. I was trying to say,
yeah,
out of difference. It is, in fact, it is a product of the liberal and Enlightenment rational order, where because it was born in racism, it lacks the tools to unmake racism, as if you wanted to kind of steelman their argument.
Right. Understood. So you see this showing up in curriculums, in ways that you just described, having negative consequences for children, even small children. Yeah. What are some other things that you're seeing that are troubling you here?
Well, I see it everywhere. It's kind of in most institutions, right? I hear from corporate leaders all the time that it's infecting into their companies, and it's causing hostile working conditions where, everybody walks on eggshells, team functioning breaks down because everybody's hyper aware of race. I've made the joke before, and I guess it's a little more than a joke, that we heard that when Trump put out the executive order, as he phrased it, banning critical race theory, which isn't technically what it did. But when he put out that executive order banning critical race theory, people shot back, he's banned racial sensitivity training. And I shot back, he didn't ban racial sensitivity training, he banned racial hypersensitivity training. And this is the dynamic that you hear from corporate leaders, is that when it comes in, is that it starts to polarize the office environment, and it causes people to walk on eggshells. I think there's evidence backing that up, that it causes people to avoid cross-racial interactions, which people who are lower on the totem pole are the ones who get hurt by that most. And then it's in the military. I've heard from people at both enlisted and at the officer level telling me that they have, regular, I think monthly diversity seminar training meetings or whatever, and it just the rooms just polarize by race. I think that's probably bad for unit cohesion, if I had to make a guess.
Sure.
And so I worry that generating I worry that generating more salience in social categories that are not very good social categories is not a healthy direction. And when it's tied to something like race, which is, first of all, unavoidable. Like, you can't help how you were born. You can't change how you were. I mean, we got all these kind of white women trying to pretend that they're black now, but or Latina or whatever. But you can't really change how you were born. You can't change that.
Right.
You can't change your skin color without some very radical surgical procedure that nobody would believe anyway. And then it's also something that's personal to people very frequently, right? Especially people who have had the unfortunate circumstance of having it shoved in their face all the time. Hey, you're an X person. And I'm not going to say, one race or another in that case, because I think it's been common for 30 years or more, and especially if people have traveled to other countries, to have experienced that regardless of their race. I'm not saying it's even either. I don't think it's even. But if you're reminded constantly, hey, you are a person of X race, then it becomes something that's caught up with your sense of identity and the struggle for humanity that you have, right? So when you start making that more and more and more salient, you can't, all all we know about, like, identity level issues that people have in interpersonal dynamics is that they're almost intractable. So my thought is that if you're taking something and increasing that salience, you're creating problems or inflaming problems that could be dealt with in a better way, a much better way, some other way.
Now, do you, however, see anti-racism as seeking to respond to any real problems in society? Because I think that
Yes.
I think that most folks, certainly many, but maybe most folks would look at the experience of African Americans and other folks historically, but also contemporaneously, as being subjected to a raft of factors that lead to dramatic social disparities that I think any well-meaning person would tend to want for us to overcome. But because
Mhm.
these disparities and because these problems really do seem to break down strikingly along racial lines, the instinct to notice race, right, and perhaps to even emphasize the role of race and racism in these outcomes seems like an understandable instinct or impulse to most people. So, do you see them as responding to at least to some problems that are real?
Yes, and badly. I do. So, I mean, let's take for just a very concrete example. They're theorizing about the idea of colorblind approaches. So, most people have seen the famous interview because it goes around like virally well, certainly every February, but probably every year actually, or more often than every year, where Morgan Freeman sat down with Mike Wallace and they had their little famous 1 minute clip that gets, I don't know the rest of the context of the video, to be honest with you, but in that 1 minute clip they're talking about Black History Month, and
Mm,
Morgan Freeman shoots back at Mike Wallace, like catches him like, I don't want a Black History Month. And I don't
mm,
know where Morgan Freeman sits on this issue now. I know where he sat
mm,
on that particular interview because
sure.
I've seen it 3,500 times probably. And he shoots back and he says, I don't want a Black History Month. And Mike Wallace is like, why not? He just can't fathom this. How are we
Mm,
going to get over racism if we don't have something like Black History Month? And he was like, well, which month is White History Month? And
mm,
then Mike Wallace is like, well, I'm Jewish. He's like, well, which month is Jewish History Month? And he was like, there isn't one. He says, well, do you want one?
mm,
And then Mike Wallace is like, no, I don't want one. And he's like, well, I don't want a Black History Month either. And he says, well, how are we going to end racism then? And Morgan Freeman says, we're going to stop talking about it.
mm,
You're not going to call me a black man, and I'm not going to call you a white man. You're going to call me Morgan Freeman, and I'm going to call you Mike Wallace.
mm,
Right. So this is color blindness.
mm,
And so color blindness is a thing. It's very dangerous and very fruitful at the same time. Like many swords, it has two edges.
mm,
So Morgan Freeman's speaking to the right side of it. Let's not put undue social significance into racial categories. Now, there's a dark side to this, or a bad side to this, that blade that faces back toward you with color blindness, which has a name, but people don't know that name, which is called racism blindness.
mm,
It's when people go too far and they say, oh, well, I just see you as a man and you just see me as a man and we're just men now. So there's no racism. Racism's never happened.
mm,
Right. Or it's over. Racism's over. And that denies something that is actually still, it's not over. It's not
mm.
totally over.
Right.
It's much reduced from certain circumstances in the past, but it's certainly not over. And you can actually start to sweep real problems under the rug. Right. Okay. So that frustration in seeing real problems that still remain being swept under the rug is a real place that this approach to anti-racism, like I said, seeks to try to address.
Mm. I think the
So,
distinction you're making is very clear. Would you mind pausing just very briefly to say something about the definition of racism in the context in which we're speaking? Because I think that that arrives at the
mhm.
crux of what makes this such a such a difficult issue to talk through, even intellectually,
No,
certainly in
that's right.
casual political conversations, because we're
No, right.
defining racism in very different ways on different sides of this question.
That's right. Well, in fact, there are probably 4 or 5 different definitions of racism that kind
Mm,
of get just conflated and prevent people from having clear dialogue about it. And
right.
the adjective problem, did you put the modifier in front of the word to clarify what you meant or not? So on the one side of this conversation, we are typically talking, and I know, so what Morgan Freeman's personally talking about, especially, is kind of this older, broader view of racism. Do you think one race is superior to another? Or
Mm,
even do you see race as having, and this is my actually operating definition of racism that I use now, and I've written about this. Um, do you put social significance into racial categories for the purpose of prejudice or discrimination?
mm,
Right. So that I think is a good operative definition of racism. Now, on the other hand, there are, whether you want to call it systemic or structural racism, institutional racism is another thing. I think that's enough. We don't have to get into all the different variants that the
mm,
other side of this dialogue
right.
uses. Systemic is most common. Structural is slightly different, but basically means the same thing to
Mm,
first approximation. And then institutional is obviously something slightly different. It's something more specific. And I actually would include institutional racism under the definition that I gave. If an institution is behaving in a way that puts social significance into racial categories. So, for example, Jim Crow laws would be institutional racism for sure. The thing that California attempted to do with that proposition that was going to remove the anti-discrimination language risks putting systemic racism or institutional racism into play. Even bad failure, but well-intended, say, progressive policy could be institutional racism, right? You could point at, the conservatives in the room would point at the so-called entitlement programs that were part of the Great Society that Johnson put into play. He'd say, well, that devastated Black communities. And in fact, their argument about people like the critical race theorist like Derek Bell, who founded it, is that Derek Bell was speaking into the problem that bad progressive policy had created and it had created institutional racism where it didn't need to be created. Because the argument, of course, is if you look at the Great Society, it does actually include affirmative action programs. So it does actually have race in it. But a lot of times what you'll have is a situation, this is where you hear more of the systemic or structural argument. You'll have a situation where they'll say, oh, we're going to create this program for poverty, right? Knowing that the target demographic the target population that they're going into is demographically skewed very heavily, say Black or Latino or something. And therefore the program is actually not about poverty. It's going to have massively racially disparate impacts. We hear this a lot about the crime bill where we talk about the drug policy, for example, like, oh, we're going to have kind of corporate white collar wrist slapping penalties for powder cocaine, but we're going to have just brutal penalties for crack cocaine, right? And so on the one hand, you do have corporate crime who's doing powder cocaine versus, street crime. And I'm not talking about racism. I'm not talking about anything like that. I'm talking about what professionals versus dudes on the street, but that skews racially overwhelmingly and had a hugely racially disparate impact. And did the people who created those policies have the intention to bake actual racism into it? Well, they might have actually. Certainly it had that impact. Right. And so the question boils down there to impact versus intent. So I didn't give a very good definition. My definition of racism, when I talk about racism, what I usually have in mind, unless I've specified that the system itself is skewed in some way or another, or that there's these diffuse, difficult to pin down aspects to society that create different outcomes by racial category on average for maybe unknown reasons. That's systemic racism. My definition is usually, is a person or institution putting social significance into racial categories for the purpose of discriminating or enacting prejudice? And I'm wholly against doing that on any level in any direction.
Okay.
Without doing the sloppy thing of ignoring, like if you came to me and you told me like, man, I experienced this racist incident, this is what's going on, or every time I go to Trader Joe's, I don't want to pin Trader Joe's is probably fine, but every time I go to the store or whatever, this happens. I don't want to deny hearing you out, right? And I don't want to just brush that away and say, no, man, it's 2020. There's no 21. There is no racism now. That's over. That's also a mistake that shouldn't be being made. And I do think that, in fact, what I call crap approach to anti-racism that we hear from this kind of the progressive side of the aisle, I think has made a valid call to better listening, more taking people seriously. And I think that when people cry out and say, this thing that you're doing for us is not working, or it's causing these problems, or we still have this issue, or this is concentrating this problem, that we've done a pretty bad job still historically of listening to that and taking it seriously. On the other hand, there's also the possibility of listening to something that I said it this way before. There's a difference between listen and believe and listen and take seriously, or listen and consider. There's a difference between those things.
So what I hear you saying is that we have with anti-racism a way of evaluating the social order and all of these sort of the animating factors that drive our society and the disparities of our society, that centers race in a way that makes it the operative factor by which we arrive at our disparities, that this is, in the history of Western civilization, always been true. It continues to be true to this moment, but that in centering race in this analysis, in this way, we reintroduce a social significance to race that in turn reintroduces many of the ancient problems and evils, if you might go so far as to say, in terms of how this impacts the way in which we operate our institutions, the way in which we interact with one another socially. We apply this analysis in a way that uses the machinery of the educational system, the government, etc., to, in essence, toxicify the relationships that exist between white people and black people and white people and perhaps folks across the color spectrum and across the identity spectrum. We set in place rules for communication or discourse that operate upon, perhaps I'm inserting some of my own language here, but a standing to speak, which corresponds to identity, which justifies itself on the basis of seeking to rectify historic inequities, but in so doing, in essence, instantiates a modern stratification, which is more or less a race-based hierarchy that, on its face, therefore becomes a racist enterprise according to the definition of race that you're putting forward, which is introducing social significance into racial categories. And that yet and even so, you do see this perspective as groping towards an answer to what are still real questions of social disparities between groups, real sort of problems with respect to the relative positioning of groups of Americans in terms of access to opportunity, access to a better and more equitable or equal quality of life, and that it even seeks to head off what you consider to be an actual legitimate concern, which is that it is possible for us to turn a blind eye to racism, and I think I hear you saying that racism can come from individuals or institutions, and it's possible for us to not be sensitive to that reality in an effort to be colorblind. And so you see anti-racism as responding to that, as responding to these structural sorts of inequities, or at least these disparities in well-being between groups, but that it does so by recapturing the sort of black magic of racism that is in and of itself the historic source of the very problems that anti-racism is seeking to contend with today. Do I have your perspective more or less accurate?
Yes, that was an excellent summary.
Right.
I mean, I can get deeper into any of that you want.
I know you can.
But that is certainly
Right.
that you had a very good expression, Rappaport's rules achieved, of my argument there. Yeah, to that level of depth.
Right. Well, excellent. Okay. So, by the way, are you pressed for time? Because if it's possible for us to go a little long, it might be
I
cool
have
to
2 hours.
Oh, good. Good. Excellent. Usually these are 1 hour conversations, but I think it'd be good to take this one a little longer here. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is sort of offer my own perspective on this suite of issues. And I think I'd like to start by sort of contextualizing this in things that I notice about our respective identities within the context of this conversation. And it's a funny thing, I'll just say really quick, because I think that the sort of small L liberal approach to civic and maybe just intellectual dialogue in general, I think it tends to prize, and I certainly have always, tended to prize logical discourse in this way, as optimally functioning when we can pursue reason in a way that allows reason to sort of stand apart from whatever subjective implications we might think are brought to bear upon it by our own sort of particular, our own particular cultural and experiential sorts of identities, because there's we tend to want to think that reason, when properly done, is able to shine a light on what is true, independent of whatever we may want or not want to be true, right? But part of what makes the conversations interesting in this identity sort of interested landscape of social discourse is that it does, for me, connect to another sort of important point, I think, that has to be sort of understood about the act of reasoning in particular, which is the fact that I think it's ultimately we can engage in a discourse that strives towards objectivity. But I do think that we are sort of fated to pursue the objective through the subjective lens, ultimately. Meaning that certainly, I mean, this is controversial now too. You would like to think that you and I could say, well, yeah, but 2 + 2 = 4 either way. Suddenly I'm noticing people have other answers to that question. But it is to say that the more we get into, what some people term to be wicked problems, right? As opposed to tame problems, which are mechanical in nature. You have an equation, you calculate it out, you get a fixed answer. But wicked problems, which tend to be social and certainly policy questions and so forth, are problems that are themselves impacted by the subjectivity of the personalities and the value systems of the personalities engaging in the analysis there, right?
That's right.
Right. And so I find that to be a helpful thing to name, simply because it helps to sort of set the intellectual context in a way that I think grounds this particular sort of conversation in a way that's that I think will prove itself to be relevant here. So,
no, I agree with this.
Right. Now, you and I are really, I was really, I've interested in talking to you for so many reasons. One of them is that you and I have a lot in common, and yet we are sort of mirror images of each other in many respects. And I'll tell you what I mean. On the one hand, on the level of labels, it's not just that, like, you're white and I'm black. By the way, I'm white too, because I'm half black, half white. But it's on the level of labels, it's not just that. You, from what I can tell, are a white progressive, right? I mean, ultimately, when you boil it down, I think that your essential political disposition is to believe that the function of government can be employed in an aggressive way, potentially, or at least in a proactive way, to engage policy and social ills. I don't think that you're, from everything I've heard from you in the past, are a sort of like quite laissez-faire sort of economic thinker. I don't think that you're a social conservative, if I'm not mistaken.
No.
I think that you're sort of agnostic or soft atheist, so to speak, right?
That's right.
Right. You are a person who, for all of those labels, is someone who is associated, at least by so many of his critics, with, at this point, I guess, the cultural political movement that Donald Trump leads. I do believe that you voted for Donald Trump. I did. I believe, right.
And I was held to account on TV in 3 countries. It was very exciting.
Right, precisely. And so, for all of your sort of intellectual bona fides in these other directions, in spite of those things, you have found yourself, for reasons having to do with, I think, so much of what you just explained in terms of the excesses of anti-racism, but also other things associated with, viewed as being sympathetic, and I guess are sympathetic to whatever degree and in whatever way, with sort of the Trump populist, sort of nationalist right, if you will. Now, who am I? I am, mixed race, African-American guy. I'm a registered Republican. I don't know actually if you're a registered Democrat, but I
have never registered.
You never registered, right? But I have heard you refer to yourself as progressive, and I've followed you long enough to know, listening to your earlier conversations, that was not, I don't think, a shallow statement in terms of, you're certainly left in your general sort of default political orientation. Right. Correct me if I'm wrong. I on the other hand have been a registered, I grew up more of a Democrat, but I've been a registered Republican now for many years. I ran for office. I ran for Congress as a Republican, worked in the Republican Party. Consider myself to be conservative, and yet I think that I am probably viewed. I did not vote for Donald Trump. I was, in opposition to Trump since, before he ran. I probably tend to be lumped in with the never Trump crowd, although that, there are various reasons why I don't necessarily like that
that's its
term. Right. There's a cliquish sort of aspect to that, nevertheless. And yet I, even beyond that, I have a strong and deep sort of sympathy for so much of what I consider to be sort of the longer root of, I guess, the anti-racist movement in America today, because I am
which root?
Right. So
it has several roots.
Understood.
I'm curious which one.
Understood. Yeah. So to speak to the root that, because I understand there's philosophical answers to this question, but there are also cultural and social answers to this question, right? I'm going more in that latter direction, but I think they all intersect here. Okay. I am a person who has deep sort of sympathy, I think, for that movement, largely because I'm somebody who feels that the African American experience in the United States of America up to this present day is one that has been subject to a tremendous sort of weight of oppression that has expressed itself in institutional and social and cultural and psychological dimensions in ways that have made it, in ways that have been significant across the entire arc of American history, and that notwithstanding significant progress that has been made in American life and social history, certainly dating from the civil rights movement to now, nevertheless, I think, and maybe we can say that this is changing now, but nevertheless has found itself, to my eyes, largely underappreciated by the American mainstream, just how disenfranchised, just how marginalized so much of Black America is, even going into the 21st century. Now, I think for the benefit of those listening, I should flesh all that out a little bit, because I don't want to just throw out those characterizations or that general statement and not apply any substance to it. I mean, I think that, it would be uncontroversial for us to say that, well, life was pretty bad for Black folks for, 1619 to the end of the Civil War. You have the abolition of slavery, but then you proceed from that into 100 years of white racist terrorism from the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow oppression and so on and so forth. Where the analysis starts to become a little bit controversial, or people begin to diverge, I think, is in the aftermath of the civil rights movement going into the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's a point at which many people, I think, sort of jump off of the train that says that, oh, life is so bad for Black people in America, because at that point, many folks say, okay, you've got your equal rights and so forth. Everything else is up to you. And if folks want to, to be crass about it, because I hear conservatives and other critics sort of the progressive, take here, give this kind of reaction. So to be crass about it, some people will say, hey, you guys have your equal rights now, and if you want to shoot each other and have babies out of wedlock and so forth, well, the consequences of that are on you. I do not look at it as having been nearly so simple. Yeah, well, and this is the funny thing, because I think that you agree with that, but just to flesh it out a bit, and if there is something you disagree with, feel free to name it. But what I see, what I say is this: imagine you have, let's just take just African American person, let's name him Jamal. I had many friends named Jamal. Jamal's ancestors were brought, in chains to the to North America, maybe in the 1700s, 1800s, what have you, and remained in bondage all the way up until the Civil War was done. And as when that happened, it's possible that his ancestors stayed in the South where they weren't given any support in terms of being able to make a life for themselves, had no education. Some of them at various points migrated to other parts of the country where racism was honestly, if less overt, just as severe in certain respects, at least. I guess my own history, or Jamal's history might have landed him eventually in Los Angeles, where I'm in. If Jamal's ancestors had migrated out to Los Angeles either in the late 1800s when a few black people came over and when historic South Central, I believe, was first established, more black folks came over in about the 1930s, 1940s. Let's put Jamal there. His grandparents may have come out to work in the munitions factories in order to support the Second World War. They would have found themselves in L.A., although similar circumstances persisted in other cities in the country, in a context where once the war was over, the housing facilities that they stayed in were converted to public housing projects. They would not have been allowed to have moved into suburban areas that were largely white because of the practice of redlining in Los Angeles. So that would have been if you had moved west, for people who are familiar with LA, across Crenshaw Boulevard. There was an invisible line that kept you from moving in that direction as a black person. If you went east across the Alameda corridor, you'd be actively beaten by the police. That was, just sort of a regular fact of life in Los Angeles for black folks here in the 40s, 50s, going into the 60s. Then in the 60s, you would think that you would say, okay, the story gets better. You had the Watts riots. You had terrible things that happened. Dr. King was assassinated. Obviously, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and others in the Black Power movement, Hamilton, etc. But on the other hand, of course, you had the Voting Rights Act. You had the Civil Rights Act before it. You had the enfranchisement of African Americans, and great gains were made in American life. And beyond that, popular culture sort of starts to value the image of African Americans more. All of this is true. But all of these gains, particularly on the legal side, were largely significant and meaningful in the South and in the rural South, most specifically. A lot of times we forget the fact that a majority of African Americans, even at that time, were living in urban centers in America, and a majority of those outside of the South. And in those communities, Jim Crow policies weren't a factor to begin with. Things like redlining and, relationships with the police department that were fraught even in the 60s, those were pre-existing problems. The underfunding of the educational system, et cetera, et cetera. All of these were longstanding problems in the places where most black people lived that were untouched by the legal gains made by Dr. King and the civil rights movement that were largely aimed at activism, aimed against that group of white people that, most other white people were totally fine with targeting, which was ignorant backwoods Southerners and so forth. But the deeper sorts of institutional reforms that might have been meaningful for creating a landscape of equity or equality in America would have had to have ultimately applied themselves to the urban centers, to the North, to the West, to New York, to Chicago, to LA, so on and so forth. And so Dr. King and others towards the end of Dr. King's life, Dr. King, he starts to apply himself to this project of challenging sort of the deeper structures of American society beyond just Jim Crow segregation, right? And, he dies as he begins to mobilize a poor people's campaign. He seeks to bring folks together across the color line to advocate for a greater quality of life for all folks. But he certainly saw racism as something, and you can hear King begin to speak in these terms, even towards the end of his life, that racism has not been eliminated by the gains of the civil rights movement by 1967, 1968. In some respects, these practices and these attitudes are burrowing deeper into the institutions and deeper into the culture of American life, even as the gains made up until that time were real. And so King dies, and a lot of good does happen. And this is where, in my analysis, the Black experience itself splits in a way that colors, no pun intended, but that colors our understanding of what's actually going on in America in this time. Because, I would argue that certainly according to our sort of traditional, conventional use of the definition of the word racist, American society does become dramatically less so, even in the South, but across American society. On the pop culture level, of course, I mean, you've got athletes and artists and personalities. I mean, from Muhammad Ali to Michael Jackson to Oprah Winfrey to, obviously eventually, fast forward enough, you get to Barack Obama. But African American individuals suddenly arise as the premier representatives of American culture to the world. And that is happening on a wave of embrace in so many of America's middle class, suburban, and multicultural communities of Black folks in particular. And so you've got African Americans and other people of color as well, but you have African Americans who are welcomed into the universities. Obviously, you have affirmative action programs that come into play, increasingly welcomed into Hollywood and the entertainment industry, and all sorts of things problematic, I guess, about movies in the 70s, the blaxploitation and all that. But nevertheless, you've got Black people coming into academia, coming into Hollywood, leaders of the civil rights movement, pivoting into key positions of leadership in the Republican Party, being elected to Congress. And therein, you have sort of this elevation of at least a stream of African Americans who find themselves deeply integrated into the professional, political, institutional, and social fabric of mainstream American life, particularly in progressive sort of institutional and cultural enclaves. Although something somewhat similar, I believe, was even happening in various churches in the South. The churches became more integrated. And, obviously Billy Graham helped sort of pioneer the early expression of those efforts in the 1960s with his crusades, the first integrated evangelical gatherings, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So all of that was happening, and all of that was genuine progress. But what I think people failed to see is that, for every individual who left an inner city community to go to a university, you had however many more who were locked probably into an urban environment wherein, first of all, you've had something of a talent and a brain drain in communities where some of the most gifted folks and some of the folks who have the most going for them in terms of their family context and so forth in urban communities are judging their ability to succeed in America on their ability to leave the Black community. And so they do leave the Black community. This happens at a time where economic opportunity for working class Black people has already fallen dramatically. If you take it back to LA, just because of changes in immigration policy and so forth, African Americans used to dominate the agricultural sector. They used to dominate the service and hospitality sector. And through changes in immigration, we insourced competition that eliminated that economic avenue for success for most African Americans. African Americans worked in manufacturing. That was a key part of their being a Black middle class in places like South Central, et cetera. Those jobs, of course, went overseas, went to China and elsewhere, so on and so forth. What was introduced in its stead, and this is my analysis, and this part of it is more conservative, but what was introduced in its stead, I think, was the social welfare programs, the Great Society. And it's important to acknowledge, I believe, that the Great Society did, in fact, do a tremendous amount of good where it needed to do good the most, which was eliminating hunger in America, eliminating, desperate poverty that led to starvation. Black and white people in Appalachia and beyond, from the South to urban communities, were in many cases starving in America prior to the Great Society. The Great Society eliminated hunger. So, for anybody who has a totally jaded view of it, that needs to be acknowledged. And yet, it also functioned in a way so as to disincentivize the formation of the family, nuclear family, of marriage in the Black community. And this is something that Martin Luther King Jr. criticized in his own time. The structure of welfare programs being such that they basically encourage people to not have a father in the home. It provided a subsistence income to communities in the absence of economic opportunity, and therefore the opportunity for social mobility, at a moment in which the Black community also had just witnessed its most highly respected and revered leaders, and Dr. King in particular, although again, not only him, murdered.
Yes.
So you had leadership at the highest level of black society decapitated. On a local cultural level, you had folks who should have been in positions of leadership in their own communities leaving to integrate into white communities. You had an absence of economic opportunity, the addition of some subsistence income, but no deeper, more meaningful avenues towards community sort of prosperity. And into that mix, ultimately, heroin, but particularly crack cocaine, ultimately come. And
Yep.
for young people, and particularly young men, who are looking for a way to make something of themselves, to make their own money, to be able to establish their own sort of, way through life, and people who are already very much jaded for reasons that I think are eminently understandable against the larger sort of institutional, structural, cultural status quo of American life. People who saw Dr. King die even while they did not experience any meaningful gains from the civil rights movement itself in the context, again, in particular of urban America. The Black rural South is a different thing. But for many, if not most African Americans, not seeing direct gains from the civil rights movement. In this context, you have an underground black market economy within which, people start building empires that poison their neighbors. And that's bad enough. But that elicits the response from law enforcement, from the police state, so on and so forth. And in that equation, the mass incarceration of African Americans in particular, but, many other people as well, begins. And it's a funny thing because, one of the reasons I began to become more conservative, economically speaking too, in particular, in my late teens, early 20s, was because of the fact that I looked at, the Reagan economy and, I looked at sort of what I felt was the success of certain periods of economic growth in America's history. And I thought, well, look, it seems like these policies work. And part of the evidence for that is that they work for black people. The black unemployment rate dropped by its most historic margin ever under Reagan. It may have gotten down even more so under Trump, although that's a separate economic conversation. I looked at things like that and I thought, well, yeah, market economics, can work for everybody. And statistically speaking, it's proven to work for the black community. And, I was contrasting it with low levels of growth during the Obama administration and so forth. And so that was a big part of what sort of pushed me towards market conservatism. And I still am broadly speaking, a market driven economic thinker. I still consider myself to be more conservative on that level. But one very simple fact, because I've heard people arguing these statistics back and forth forever, but one simple fact is that the way we calculate the unemployment rate in America is to only calculate those people who are non-institutionalized, meaning they're not, in a university, they're not, in a mental health facility, and they are not in prison, which means that, the drop in the unemployment rate during the 1980s has to be taken against the context of the fact that a massive number of African Americans who should have been in the workforce were in jail instead, right?
Right.
As a product of the confluence of these factors. And so imagine Jamal's relatives going all the way back, to slavery, all the way back to emancipation, Reconstruction, terrorism in the South, moving out to the north of the West, experiencing redlining, experiencing all sorts of subtler but still real and solid forms of oppression, persecution, so on and so forth, not experiencing the gains of the civil rights movement, losing economic opportunities, finding themselves subject not just to crack cocaine, but to the heavy-handed police response to that, within which you also have clear visibility into the corruption of many police departments while this is taking place, because from Harlem to Los Angeles, you have police departments that are visibly on the take and themselves profiting from the drug trade. You see the larger American neglect of your circumstances, even as a few African Americans are lifted up and celebrated, and it's more than a few, right? But it doesn't touch you. Suddenly suddenly we find ourselves in the early 90s, Suddenly we find ourselves in the Watts riot, in the LA riots. I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal, you may not have seen it, but that contrasted my black experience to my wife's black experience. And, we live 15 minutes and 15 miles apart in early 1992 when Rodney King was beaten and when the riots erupted. But I lived in multicultural Culver City, and liberal middle-class suburban community, and she lived in the Jordan Downs projects in Watts. I vaguely remember something weird happening outside during the riots. And I remember my mother stepped out of her door to go to work, and my dad, had this deep anxiety. And later on, I learned that it was the scariest moment of his life because he thought she'd never come back, that she would bother to go to the office when things were on fire in LA and so forth. But my wife, at the age of a year younger than me, remembers those days vividly as being in the midst of a war zone, She remembers gunshots. She remembers fire. She remembers hearing people screaming. She remembers people running in and out of the house. She remembers having to lay on the floor. That was the beginning of her American experience. And growing up in Watts, growing up in South Central LA, and in the projects in particular, she was a soldier, but she has seen more death and more murder and more destruction, chaos than I think some folks have seen serving in Iraq or Afghanistan. That has been her American experience. It looks nothing like mine, and we're both Black, right? But I recognize the fact that for a tremendous cross-section of Black America, I think her experience and mine, so imagine Jamal's life, leading up just to today. And I'll tell you, I lived in the Jordan Downs projects myself for about a year or so with my wife, another complicated story. But I met Black folks living in the projects who had never been to the beach in Santa Monica. It's a few miles away. But the only white folks many of them had any exposure to growing up were overworked school teachers who, were maybe, working in their communities to begin with because they weren't the teachers who folks wanted in the better performing schools, and county workers and bureaucrats who are overwhelmed by the level of poverty they're having to service through a clumsy sort of bureaucratic system, and police officers who, and I know many officers in LA. I work with the cops in some ways and so forth, but police officers who themselves feel like they are considered the enemy in the communities that they police, and who many times act like the enemy, or at least act like their job is to forcibly suppress the behavior of a community of people that they oftentimes, and certainly not always, but that in certain cases they don't have any felt connection to. For Jamal, growing up, that's life in America. That's American history, right? And so I think that where that historic experience and that subjective experience winds up colliding with the liberal values that I think you and I both value and both advocate for in perhaps pretty different ways in some contexts, but where that winds up colliding is in the fact that while it's easy enough to say that if we decline to invest undue social significance in race, we still retain the option of being thoughtfully sensitive to the circumstances in which race matters. But for many folks, keep in mind, too, that in the African American community in particular, part of the original backdrop for all of this is the fact that you've got a people that were taken away from any historic sense of who they were culturally and so forth prior to slavery. And I feel this viscerally because on the white side of my family, I mean, I can trace my lineage back, in some respects, like, I lose the immediate family line, but I can trace it back to Britain and Ireland and so forth. But I can generally tell you where my people were in Europe and so forth, going back hundreds and even thousands of years. You can sort of roughly surmise it. And even if I don't know exactly, I understand the larger sort of, European and Christian history that attends to that. On the Black side of my lineage, it stops, it stops in the 18th century. And there are things we can learn about Africa and West Africa and so on and so forth. There's more to be found there than people realize. But, it's for all sorts of reasons. It's for so many people, there's not the sense of having had that cultural anchor that helps us define who we are and therefore how we move forward past a certain point. And so for Jamal, just our hypothetical, our hypothetical African American individual here, who is heir to all of this, there's a sense that race has defined my experience because it is woven through everything that has produced my circumstances, including both the operations of the institutions that impact me, as well as the attitudes of the white people who are generally in positions of power in these institutions, whether they realize it or not. And I'll add one final little twist to this. Part of what kind of got me realizing that there was a meaningful kind of bifurcation here in both the Black experience, in the Black experience and including the ways in which different Black people see white people as relating to them, was something that happened to me one day after school. I would have been it would have been senior year in high school. So, I grew up lighter skinned. I've got a different hair texture than most Black folks. Like I said, growing up for me, Culver City and then later Woodland Hills, California, I never felt distrustful of authority. I didn't feel distrustful of white people at all because I felt like my dad is white, my family's white. I feel well integrated, I also spoke a certain way, though. I noticed that white people were very much at ease around me in a way that they may not always have been at ease with the kids who are being bussed in from inner city LA to go to the schools that I went to. But the significance of that wasn't driven home to me until one day I did something that I hadn't done before. And my hair grew my hair out in a natural. It's actually starting to grow out again now. You can't tell because I have it sort of gelled up a little bit. But once it got long enough, I got my hair braided, had it cornrowed, right? Like Allen Iverson or Snoop or, any number of folks. And when I stepped onto campus after having my hair braided, everybody looked at me different. And the Black kids hanging out in the quad literally started giving me a round of applause, literally started clapping because it's like, oh, shoot, hey, wait a second, he's got some flavor, so on and so forth. And that was a funny thing. But then I noticed that when I went to the market, when I just sort of went to other places, just casually going about, my day in the city, I noticed that at least some white people sort of started to act, the body language seemed to be different a little bit. Mm-hmm. And, there's a vibe that seemed to be shifting. And it took me a second to sort of put a finger on it. And then one day after school, I was walking towards the bus, and I thought I'd run a bit of an experiment. There's a white guy with a dress shirt and slacks on, looked like he was taking his lunch break, who was walking my way, from the other direction. And I called out to him. I said, hey. And I could see his eyes sort of flicker up a little bit and then flicker back down. And I said, hey. And I called out to him again. He took out his phone, started to look at it. And then I said, hey, excuse me. And I, put a little more into it the last time. And so then he looked up and he had sort of a worried look on his face, it seemed. And I said, I'm sorry. I said, I don't mean to bother you, but I'm trying to catch my bus here, and I don't actually have my phone on me, so I don't know what time it is, and I'm worried that I might have missed it. Could you tell me what's the time? And when I spoke, he visibly sort of sighed a little bit. It wasn't a dramatic thing, but there was a sigh, and he looked at his phone. He said, he said it's 3:12 or something. I said, oh, okay. Thank you so much. I said, I think I'll just make it. And he said, not a problem. You have a good day. I was like, you have a good day too. Now, maybe there are other interpretations to that interaction, but along with all sorts of other subtle things I had been through, that made me think you know what? A lot of Black folks would have looked at that interaction or looked at a component of it, the earlier part of it, and said, this guy's racist. I said, but it's not as simple as that. He's got a cultural association. That's correct. With the way I'm wearing my hair. Because the way I'm wearing my hair is probably making him think of all sorts of rappers and all sorts of, I don't know, crazy athletes or what have you. It's making him think of all sorts of other things that people tend to associate with Blackness and so forth. But the way I spoke signaled something different. Now, I could have adopted a certain idiomatic kind of dialect, and I think it might have perpetuated, the discomfort, but I signaled something else with the way I spoke. And so that, on the one hand, that made me think, okay, well, this is good news. I carried this around with me for a while because I was like, it means that, white folks in America, just like I always thought, are not racist. We've just got cultural differences between us, and we need to sort of understand the differences, the way we speak, so on and so forth. But what I came to think a little bit more on later was the fact that, but you know what? Hair, dialect, all sorts of other things, like that is what it, it's not all of it, but that is a significant part of what it means to be black for a lot of folks in terms of how they are presented to the world. Because unlike me, most folks aren't going to be able to change, their complexion. You can change your hairstyle and so forth. But if you grow up speaking a certain way, these are things that you don't just flip a switch exactly and eliminate. And so, when I look at the anti-racist movement, I see it as seeking to address this structural history, which in my mind is deeply tragic, while at the same time it's seeking to engage social dynamics across color lines, which don't necessarily, I think, to my mind, indicate that white people are racist according to the conventional way in which, we tended to use that term, but that nevertheless is looking at something real in terms of the breakdown of empathy that takes place, perhaps along cultural lines that are themselves so tightly correlated to race in so many cases that for many folks, it's just an immaterial distinction, right? So, okay, so I'm gonna wrap it up with this because I know I've been going on for a while. But I want to put that in front of you because the weird thing is I'm not sure like where you and I really disagree on anything. I don't think that we really do too much. I mean, let me know if I do because I don't want to get that wrong. But I feel like where the difference seems to be is there seems to be a real difference between you and I in terms of, I don't know, the empathy or sympathy component with where we are viewing some of this as coming from. Because at least when I hear you in some of your interviews, it seems like ultimately, you get a lot of you get a lot of this like intellectually and so forth, but you are in this position in the conversation where you are like you're like a battering ram. Well, not a battering ram. You're like the guy trying to hold the gate against the battering ram, I guess, that you see is coming in to destroy our liberal norms and so forth. The project that I'm committed to is much more about one of trying to empathize as much as possible with sort of the emotional kind of starting point of this perspective, because I think it is legitimately rooted in real things, and to try and engage with it in a way that can funnel that energy into a new sort of cultural understanding that allows us to be sensitive to the origins of our perspective and molding new norms from that greater understanding in the context of the sort of work we do at Braver Angels and beyond. So let me just leave it at that and see what you make of any of that.
I got lots of things because that went on. There's a lot. So, first question is: so Jamal is representative of this long history of Black experience that we've got, right? So, is Jamal more like your wife's experience or more like yours? Because they're not the same.
Yeah, exactly. Much more like my wife's experience.
Right.
Therefore,
and so you pointed out, of course, that there is a bifurcation. So I'm not trying to catch you in a gotcha or anything like that. But the point is, I think it's actually a dangerous label to call that the Black experience. I actually think that that's as dangerous a label as to say that there's a white experience or that there's an Asian experience or that there's. I think there are finer ways that could be articulated than we typically do. We're not being granular enough because I went to this thing, and this is a little story, but I want to hit you with something that I think you're going to see a lot of empathy. But this is separate from that. I went to this thing not that long ago, and we had a panel about the 1619 project. And there's like 30 of us there.
Right.
And the primary people who were leading the panel were a raft of Black gentlemen. Okay. So one of these guys, I think he's in, I don't remember, New York or something like this. His parents are Jamaican. And so real dark skin. Sounds kind of British. And he starts talking about, well, I've never actually experienced racism in my life. And I think it's probably because of the way I talk, because I speak the Queen's English, blah, blah, blah. So here's a cultural marker. If you don't know the psychology of this, actually, dialect is one of the strongest cultural identifying markers that we have.
Absolutely.
So your intuition that if you had spoken to the gentleman in the slacks differently
Mm.
he may have interpreted you differently. And I think you are correctly intuiting that there is cultural friction,
Mm.
and I'll come back to that. But then he says the same thing that you said, that I perceive that many other people probably have experienced it, and we'll call this the black experience, but it didn't apply to him. And then another guy who's far lighter skinned and has, I guess, the usual hair texture, if you will, grew up in the South, and his family was the only black family in town, intellectuals. They were scholars, and he was loved. Everybody loved him.
Mm.
I've never actually experienced racism myself in the United States either, but I'm sure lots of other people have. And of course, he has a very he doesn't sound like a Southerner, uh, but he has a very I don't know what the right phrasing. His vernacular is not African American vernacular,
Mm.
English as it's called. Um, and again, no, I haven't experienced it. Then there's this other guy. Now, short or lacking a better way to put this, and I know this will probably get turned against me. This guy's from DC. He looks, he is black. He carries himself, he's sitting in a kind of stereotypical way that you might associate with what people often call blackness. He starts talking, he sounds black, as they say. Turns out this guy grew up homeless in Philly, in the projects of Philly.
Mm.
So now he's kind of the Jamal story. He went to Philly instead of to East LA or whatever,
Mm.
and ends up working homeless, ends up working his way up, ends up going through Harvard, runs this decent sized company right now, thinks America's the greatest place in the universe because he achieved social mobility
Right.
on the grandest possible scale. The other guys, he's like, no, he's like, I have experienced racism for real, and this ain't, you guys don't know what you're talking about. That's his opinion. And so we have this whole thing. The whole thing turned, as you might expect, into a total meltdown. We have a young guy from Princeton making $1 million a year as a hedge fund guy now, young black athlete, very, very fit. And he's talking about how he experiences racism all the time. And he's pulling down $1 million a year while the rest of us are sitting here like, dude, you know. So it's like, there's a lot of variables happening here. And so the question again becomes, which one of those is the thing that we should call the black experience? I think it's a bad label is kind of what I'm getting at with that. Right now, when we start talking about, oh, well, there is something cultural going on here. And this is where you have talked to the right man, my friend, because I am from a region of the country known as Appalachia. Appalachia.
Yeah.
It depends on how you want to say it.
Mm-hmm.
And we have very white people here by the usual standards who, you know them when you see them.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And you really know them when you hear them. You really can hear when they start talking.
Yeah.
And you know. Mm-hmm. And when they come in, if they come into the store, everybody's keeping an eye on them.
Mm-hmm.
They're a community plagued by poverty. They're a community that does not have a crack cocaine problem. They have a meth problem. They're a community that has a severe opioid pills problem, but not heroin.
Right.
Fentanyl problem. So they're extraordinarily, on average, poor. They're easily identified. The Southern whites definitely are not fans of at the extreme end, the Melungeons, which I don't even know is a word you're allowed to use. I don't know if that's a slur now or not. I don't know where that's gone. I grew up hearing it sometimes. But the serious, not the rednecks, the hillbillies. Like when I grew up, you got neighborhoods in LA you're talking about. Well, there were places around here. I don't want to name any in case people can figure out where I live for sure, but not far from where I grew up. Well, I'll even name them like Nebo Mountain and Happy Valley and stuff like this. And like, you don't go there. You'll get shot. You don't go there. If they don't know your car, it's probably leaving with shotgun holes in it. Right. So, and it's the same kind of treatment though, same kind of treatment. Half of them living in trailers, half of them living in subsidized housing of some kind, junk all over the yard. I remember driving one night out in White County, Tennessee, which is pronounced White County, Tennessee. I was driving through there one night and we came up this hill. We just went out driving when I was in college just to go wherever, right? And we come on this trailer and they've got a gigantic birthday cake lit up bright as day. This is middle of April. We're at about midnight in their front yard made out of milk jugs, empty clear plastic milk jugs, translucent. Huge giant birthday cake, and it has written on the front of it, "Happy Birthday, Jesus." And we're like, where are we? What is this? And so if I started talking with that thick ass accent and I put on my overhauls, I'm going to get treated different too. And that same social experiment that you just had, I could have.
Yep.
Even now, although certainly in the 90s it would have been a thing, right? So what I see as an operative, do I call that white culture? Do I hypothesize a fictitious Bubba, and Bubba is the arbiter of that which is white culture? No, of course not. That's insufficiently granular. It's an insufficient tool to get at what's going on. And what you see there is you have the same kind of problem. You mentioned the most successful members of the inner cities, if you will, end up going off to college, or they end up getting a contract for music or sports or whatever it happens to be, and they leave the community. And I've seen a lot of people talking about this. There are actually some really great empathetic moments where some of the more prominent Black comedians sit down and talk about their own success and what it meant to have to leave that hood, as they would say it. Well, here we don't have the hood, we have the mountain. Right? And I watched people, I watched the gravity of the mountain. These people, they discourage their children from going to college. They discourage their children from becoming successful. You're supposed to stay on the mountain. You're not to betray the family. You're not to give up for the traditional values of our community, I should say. You're not to give up air values for other values.
Right.
You're not to become better. You're not to become somebody who is one of their betters, the family's betters, the neighborhood's betters, the mountain's betters.
You're not supposed to sell out.
You're not supposed to sell out.
Which is the same. It's the same kind of dynamic, you have
culturally.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to sell out culturally.
Right.
You're not supposed to become too smart for your own good. And what you're seeing is a dynamic. Two variables are relevant, or two concepts are relevant here. Multiculturalism, where you see that friction between cultures, where you're not allowed to appropriate, you don't share, whatever. Multiculturalism and cultural protectionism. And cultural protectionism, combined with that, creates difference. It creates the inability to build empathetic bridges. It creates that distrust you experience when you cornrowed your hair. It creates the exact same distrust I would experience if I threw on a kind of a white t-shirt and overalls and a John Deere hat that looks like it's got rubbed through the mud a little bit.
Right.
And I come in talking real slow.
Yeah.
Right. And I've seen this. I mean, I've talked to some people who are properly freaking scary people who are from the mountain who, it's like, I understand there are properly scary people in the hood too. But it's like equal scary, but in a very different way. And so what I see,
but all produced by hardship, all produced, I think, by circumstances that are connected to history and the stratification of cultures in ways that intersect with race, but are not necessarily, fully determined by them, because these are very, in many respects, parallel experiences. There's something I want to say about this, but please complete the picture.
I just see the cultural protectionist aspect of that, where you talk about the bifurcation of the Black community. I could talk about, I guess, the bifurcation of Southern whites or something. It's not the same, because the Appalachians and the Southerners never liked each other in the first place. There were different cultures from the beginning. We didn't, here in East Tennessee, we didn't have plantations. There are no plantations. There's not enough hillless land to have a plantation.
Right. Yeah.
You got to have some flat land to grow whatever, crops like that. We don't have it. It's a very different environment, a very different culture. And so what happens, that bifurcation's happening because there is a pressure to identify with, say, either a racial group, with Appalachians, maybe even, I don't think they would consider themselves their own racial group, but with this kind of cultural group within, to lock that up and say that that's really what makes our people our people. And that all the friction happens around, or not all, but a great deal of friction that doesn't need to necessarily happens around that particular thing, the attempt to lock up culture in a certain group of people in a certain way of life, and to express difference, not in the fruitful diversity of approach kind of way, but in the very protectionist, this is, we are us and you are them kind of way, that I think breaks down empathetic and productive bridges. And like I said, I think I understand why it happens. I understand why it happens, but the Appalachian example is striking because it's very easy to find a racial dimension when we talk about the inner city.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to find a racial dimension when we talk about hillbillies, but I can usually spot them.
Mm-hmm.
I can just look at their faces and I could tell
Right.
half the time,
Yeah.
which one they are, genetic or whatever it is. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I grew up friends with some properly crazy Southern people, or Appalachian people, I should say. And, so I had a leg in that culture too. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if TM has the authentic, white experience is a great way to go about lining this up, and then to put walls around that and say, it's so integral. That I do understand, however, when you talk about hairstyles, because of physical realities that have to do with the texture of one's hair, as it were, or
Mm-hmm.
the color of one's skin and how that reacts against sun, clothing, everything else. Like, you can probably wear pink and not look like a jerk. I
Mm-hmm.
look like an idiot. If I wear yellow, it's a nightmare. You're wearing kind of goldish now and look great. So,
Thanks, sir.
some
Right.
things work out. Some things you look like you're some combination of mayonnaise and a whipped pig or something. I don't know. Whipped pig and whipped cream.
I get it.
And but the thing is I just don't think that it's the right variable, right?
Mm.
I don't think race is the right variable here.
Mm.
And I think that the thing that puts more relevance in race, again, it's almost like there was this dragon that got loosed in 1650, if you will, to use that as a thumbtack of a date. And the dragon causes ruination, right? The dragon's bad. The ruination is there. We finally get the arrow in the heart of that dragon for the most part. The ruination's all around. And then you have these people come along and say, guess what I found? I found a dragon egg. Let's hatch it. Right. And that's what I'm worried about. That's my issue with on this level of discourse with the anti-racism. I mean, I agree with John McWhorter also that it's a religious kind of movement. I agree with Shelby Steele that it's playing into the vacuum of moral authority. I agree with your analysis of the Great Society, that for all the good that it did, it also created, you talk about, the decimation, or not even decimation, the obliteration of Black culture, for example. With slavery, I say that it happened at least 3 times, not once. You weren't just ripped up as a ethnic group, pulled over and made slaves. Then slavery ended, and slave culture, though slavery was bad, slaves themselves had slave culture, that got uprooted and destroyed. And so there's an entire tradition that kept people together and kept people, within. I'm not making an argument for slavery here. Don't get me wrong. I'm talking about another large scale change that then tore apart a functional culture that had arisen within a set of circumstances, not the circumstances themselves. Same thing happened under segregation. It wasn't good, but there was a certain sense of community and pride. You read that again very clearly at the beginning of Shelby Steele's White Guilt, for example. And then all of a sudden, as you said, it's kind of like, well, racism's over. You're on your own, guys. That's a very ugly way to put it, but that and the downsides, the failure sides of some of this.
And by
policy.
the way, it worked out that way in both coming out of the 1860s as well as coming out of the 1960s. This is itself a pattern.
Exactly. Right? Exactly. And I understand, and I actually do sympathize with the argument that the critical race theorists, for example, specifically made about these kinds of things that happened. I think they misdiagnose the problem, and I think that they take the risk of reinventing an evil that we're better off not bringing back to the forefront, right?
Yeah.
And what they misdiagnose, what I see, maybe as a conservative-ish guy or a conservative guy, you'll appreciate this. What I see when I read stuff like White Fragility, that's Robin DiAngelo. I read Shannon Sullivan's Good White People. I read Barbara Applebaum's Being Good, Being White, or maybe it's Being White, Being Good. I mix it up every time. I read these books about critical whiteness studies, and what I see is progressives discovering that they thought that they had bought themselves a ticket out of having to reckon with that more insidious, hidden racism you described as Northern racism and Western racism in the past, and they ignored it until it finally got to the point that we're at now. And often that includes progressive policy that they thought was on the right side of history that turned out to cause major problems, and they're reckoning with that in the way that people often will, which is to reject their own responsibility in creating the problem that they helped create.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think that there's something to that. I also think that there is a root of sincerity in white guilt because, I mean, there is, and, let me let me speak as a white guy for a second if I can get away with it. Maybe I can't, but
I'm a non-practicing black sometimes, so
okay, well there you go. But I mean, there's some things to feel bad about, obviously, historically
Sure.
speaking, right? And
Right.
contemporaneously speaking. Although, the issue I have with anti-racism is that it it there's so many directions I want to take this conversation right now, by the way, that it's getting very difficult to choose between the
I
different
know. I get
pathways.
it.
So I'm going to make this statement really quick, but then I'm going to jump back to something else if you'll let me. But I think that so much of the anti-racist kind of analysis in terms of how we got here is at least pointing to something that's very much true, which is to say that racism was, I think, something that, I mean, tribalism always existed, but sort of systemic racism in the sense, I mean, philosophically like systematic racism, where you have an official hierarchy of groups and so forth, I think was something that was initiated in order to preserve a certain economic arrangement that economically and politically, for that matter, empowered some white folks sort of on the upper levels. And the gift to poorer white folks was you psychologically or culturally get to think of yourself as above these other people, even though this system is also keeping you from having jobs and harming you in all sorts of indirect ways. And that even as mainstream intellectual and social culture began to realize that, hey, these are really bad premises upon which to operate a liberal democracy, this is at odds with who we want to be, you always have downstream effects over time that bleed into the trajectory of history, and that perhaps supersedes the intentions of any one individual or the other. And so I know we can go so much deeper into this, but that much at least I think is right. What I wanted to say though about your analogy between Appalachian whites and inner city black people, which I think is a good one. I think is right, and it's one that I use myself in different contexts. I would say that if there's something that makes, so you made that point in part to say that, look, there are these parallel experiences, they're real, they're related to culture, which correlates to race. Let's recognize that, but let's also recognize the fact that calling this the white experience doesn't make too much sense at the end of the day. It is an experience, I guess, within, the group of people we call white, just like, Jamal's experience is an experience within the black, within Black America, but it's not definitive of all of that experience. But if anything makes that different, I think it might be the fact that, one, the plight of Appalachian whites in America is real. It's connected to history. It's something to be understood, but it's also pretty readily identifiable, I think, as an experience that lies outside of the majority of that's not entirely representative of the majority of the socioeconomic backdrop within which most white Americans lived. That is a distinct kind of group of poor white people, and there are other poor white people. But when you look at, for instance, the welfare rolls, you'll find that in absolute numbers, there are about an equal number of blacks and whites on welfare. Actually, I think there are more whites than blacks who, traditionally are on welfare. But as a percentage of the overall demographic group, it's grossly lopsided in terms of the percentage of black people overall who are in that circumstance versus the percentage of white people. So that's one dimension. The other dimension is that, this split that I'm identifying in Black America that takes place coming out of the civil rights movement, where you've got a not insignificant number of African Americans who integrate into American society at a higher level, but this other large number, and probably larger number, that is still locked into a stagnation that, if anything, the success of these other African Americans is making harder to sort of name and detect in mainstream American society, because it's so easy to look at Michael Jordan and the fact that your kid, is going to school, with some black kids who came into the classroom and think, well, okay, we've reached the promised land. That the integrated sort of experience of black folks like me winds up becoming much more the exception than the rule, whereas the Appalachian experience is itself a bit more the exception to the rule going the other way. And in that cultural context, for a lot of black folks, keeping in mind, the black experience in some sense really is defined by struggle and the quest for freedom, emancipation, and equality. And not only is the black experience, and look, that's obviously grossly simplistic, but it's true enough, I think, to say, it's not even just that that's true for black people, but it's true for so many other people in their interactions with black people. There's a long history of white people working for the liberation of black people, from the abolitionist movement all the way on to whatever we call the current ally culture. And obviously we're talking about a distinctly different thing in so many respects. But it is to say that there's a reason there's even a phrase called the Black freedom tradition. And it's because in the context of the holistic black experience in America, it carries so much definitive weight. But I want to name that without seeming to want to negate what it is you're saying. I still take very much to heart what it is you're saying. And the truth is that you're not wrong, in my mind, to link the idea that ultimately we need to be pursuing a superordinate identity beyond racial categories that binds us. You're not at all wrong to link that to Martin Luther King Jr., I don't think. Because Dr. King, one of my principal tutor in nonviolence is a man named Harry Boyd. I don't know if you're familiar with him, professor at Augsburg University. And Harry's father worked at a high level in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. When he was a boy, when he was a teenager, he remembers being with Dr. King when King was sort of, reciting some of his lines as he prepared to give the I Have a Dream speech in the March on Washington. King sent Harry to organize poor white folks in Appalachia and parts of the rural South to be a part of the Poor People's Campaign. King talked a fair amount about the struggles of Appalachian white folks, and he talked a lot about the need for us to ultimately recognize the fact that our common humanity matters so much more than the categories that divide us. But he painted that picture while still also speaking from within the tradition of the Black freedom tradition, if you will. He still talked about the struggle of the Negro. He still talked about the historic quest that God's, people of color in America were undergoing to realize the full promise of the American dream. He was, in other words, in dialogue with Du Bois. He was in dialogue with Booker T. Washington. He was in dialogue with A. Philip Randolph historically and contemporaneously and so forth, in a context that was distinctly black, while also reaching for something that was transcendently American. And in my mind, that's what I try to do. It's a hard thing to walk, though, because so many social pressures make you choose between those two. And I think that, and look, my position as being someone who's speaking from within the black sort of communal context, and your position as someone speaking sort of outside of it, it has no bearing, I think, on the integrity of our reasoning, but it does place a different sort of, possibly different social demand on us. I can certainly imagine myself, and I will make the argument with other black folks that, like, hey, look, ultimately we've got to find a way towards an American identity that's got room for all of us, right? We've got to be able to speak, of humanity in humanistic terms. But I tend to be myself reluctant to say, to frame that in terms of don't be too black, or don't center everything too much around the black experience, or use these broad sweeping terms, because I just have this felt sense of how deep that goes and why. I try to open up kind of like another level in terms of where that can go, which I think is what King sought to do. And so again, I don't even know if you and I, well, let me know if we disagree. I'm not sure if we do. It's just weird because it seems like there's some, well, I don't know. It's like, I feel like people, when I said I was going to have a conversation with you, many people felt like there needed to be a tension between us. And I'm still trying to figure out where that tension needs to be. And I just come back to the idea that maybe this is an empathy or sympathy thing on the basis of where we are functioning in the conversation. Substantively speaking, I have to say, I don't have really much of an issue with what you're saying. I guess I'm going to let you respond to all this, but I guess what I wonder, what my hope would be, is that working together, not just me and you, but people like us across the map or whatever. Although we're both kind of weird animals, as I pointed to earlier. But my hope would be that America, let's just put it like that. My hope would be that America would be able to come to a place to where we can as a society become sensitive and sympathetic to the unique cultural dimensions that have landed all of us at our own present stations in American society, such as they are, while also pursuing a lane of discourse that doesn't seek to sort of delegitimize the kind of cultural starting points of our emotional and psychological experiences and therefore political perspectives, but seeks rather to create the space for us to build some refreshed liberal understanding of what a pluralistic sort of discourse can actually look like, that takes all of that, brings it together, but allows us to produce something that's transcendently American from that. And so that's the hope, and I wonder at least what you think of that as an aspiration.
I mean, this is why you're having a hard time finding that friction, is because I think the same thing. I actually agree with that. I think that is the objective. I think that we should also, encourage, in the name of whether it's academic freedom or just freedom of speech, people who want to put forth ideas, whether that's, Ibram Kendi, whether that's Derek Bell, whether it's Kimberly Crenshaw, that I find to be, or Robin DiAngelo, if we want to, mix it up a little bit, Richard Delgado. Now we've got some more races involved, since that's something that people care about these days. People should be able to put forth ideas that we can then mine for their value. So coming from a largely liberal intellectual position, what John Roush calls liberal science in his book, Kindly Inquisitors, which I think is probably one of the most important books in print.
Right.
I read that and I found it striking. And I meshed it with the set of ideas that I already had, which is that each of us can be pretty smart, right? You're a smart guy. I hope I'm a smart guy. People are smart people. My office mate when I was in my university doing my PhD is the smartest dude I've ever met in my life, things like this. However, in the end, we're all not nearly as smart as we think we are. The Bible refers to this as, wheat and chaff, right? So we're going to put forth our best ideas. Some of those ideas are going to be right. Some of those ideas are going to be wrong. And we depend on one another to be able to talk to one another and to cut one another's ideas down, not in a cruel, dunking kind of way, but rather in a way where we use that criticism, each criticizing each, iron sharpening iron, as it's put in the Bible, to try to reach a place. And I say that, obviously, as you identified as I guess you could have said soft atheist agnostic type, not Christian, but the biblical reference makes sense here. So to where we can, well, let me just put it more plainly. There are diamonds in the poop, but there's a lot of poop, right? People's ideas are largely a lot of horse shit. And if we can figure out where the gems are within those and clean them off, then we have something. So when you say something like this anti-racism discourse points at something, I agree with you. And that we should be able to mine that discourse for what it points at, I also agree with you. But then to take the thing on whole hog is to eat a lot of horse shit. And I'm not down for that, right? And for example, I assume you saw the National, the National African American History Museum, or however it is, the Smithsonian, put out that thing about white culture. And it said that the elements of white culture are like productivity, loyalty,
punctuality,
science,
I think.
Punctuality. And it's like, that ain't helping, right? That's not helping. Why are you doing this? No, these are human traits that any individual is capable of cultivating. These are virtues that any individual is capable of cultivating. There are very punctual Black people. There are very impunctual white people. There are very punctual and impunctual Asian people. And we could just go on. The line of punctuality slices through every human heart, right? I'm not particularly punctual, as a matter of fact. I'm pretty bad at it. And so,
although there are differences in cultural relationships to time, not in a, I don't need to be too
South Africa
meta,
time is apparently a way that you can tie it to a nationality as opposed to a race. It's apparently a big thing in South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that even that, and I totally get what it is you're saying, and I think I probably had, on an emotional level, somewhat similar reaction to that Smithsonian piece as you did, and yet I would just say even that is a somewhat more complicated conversation, because I can more or less identify kind of where that comes from in the stream of
sure.
things, right?
Yeah, so can I, but it doesn't mean that it's a valuable thing to force forward into the narrative.
Well,
I like defer to my experience of my friend Brett Weinstein, who we can call white or Jewish.
yeah, our friend,
that
definitely. Yeah.
Oh, you know Brett too. Okay,
Yeah,
good.
of course. Yeah.
And so, Evergreen, there's that fateful scene where the students are yelling at him. I don't know where he is, but in a obviously university or college building, and the students are yelling at him and they're saying, "This is a racist school. This is a racist school." And he says, "I'd like to see the evidence." Brett has a long history of fighting racism and injustice. One of the most progressive people I know. He's got the background as far as a Jewish white guy can have, I suppose, in this current milieu. And then they reply to him that if you lived it, you would know. And so your request for evidence itself is evidence of racism. I think that maybe you and I don't disagree on this, but it's maybe good to hear. This battle between the idea of one's lived experience, which is a phenomenological concept as far as philosophy goes, versus cut and dry, let's get to the bottom of it, let's see the evidence. Like that's at the heart of kind of what the so-called anti-racism movement is pushing. And as a matter of fact, it's our phenomenological experience, and I'll say it that way specifically, our lived experience overrides that of evidence. And to the point where as a woman reached out to me, last name Gonzalez, to tell me that they had done some detailed research into police use of force in Texas, police forces at one point in the last year. She sent me all this stuff. And what had happened was that they had found that there was no identifiable, the evidence did not bear out the claim that at whatever level of force they were talking about in whichever departments they were investigating in Texas. So, limited scope. I think it may have only been lethal force. I don't recall the details, but some level of force in some set of departments in some region of Texas, that they found no evidence whatsoever of racial disparity in application of force. And the result was that denied lived experience so severely, that the evidence itself denied lived experience so severely that not only should the paper be retracted, but all of the papers that all of the authors involved ever had written should be retracted, and they should lose their doctorates. And even this woman was said she should lose her high school diploma.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So at some point,
but you're asking me,
what I'm saying is at some point, you say the anti-racism movement, puts forth this document from the Smithsonian. Anti-racism movement points at these things, and you see where that document's coming from while you still viscerally react against it. So you can see the empathy there. And on some level of continuity, Brett Weinstein being told that asking for evidence is itself proof of racism and his own racism that he now has to be held to account for. And then this very extreme case of this Gonzalez woman being held to that, or pressed on that. At some point, there's a breaking point for you where, okay, I hear what you're saying, and whoa, that's way too far, is what I'm getting at. And I'm curious, where do you break on that?
Right. Well, look, it's not so much that I break. And by the way, this is relevant to the entire Braver Angels project, really, because frequently the question you're asking me is a question we get from conservatives and progressives in one form or another, one context or another. And that question is, okay, we do believe that, if you're at all interested in what we do, it's because some part of you thinks that, okay, society's going to be a bit better if we turn down the heat, depolarize a bit, and figure out how to work together again. But, racists, alt-right folks, or even just Trump supporters in general, depending on who you are on the left, like, they don't need to be a part of that conversation. Let's get with the rational, the reasonable Republicans. And then it's the same thing coming from the right. You'll have people say, okay, look, we're willing to converse with James Lindsay. We're willing to converse with reasonable liberals and so forth, that minority and whatnot. But the social justice warriors and so forth, the activists and all that, Black Lives Matter folks, some people will draw the line at Antifa. Some people draw the line at all of BLM, generally speaking. But there's an Overton window that, folks on the right who come to us oftentimes want to preserve as well. My response to all of that is to say that they're two different projects. Because, people will say, how can I work with the organization, but also do everything I can do to make sure, Joe Biden gets elected or, Donald Trump, wins in the election. And the two different projects are this. On the one hand, we all have an obligation to stand up for the things that we believe politically, to make the arguments we need to make in terms of, on a material level, where our society needs to go, to protest, articulate, and vote accordingly. But then there's also the project of rehabilitating the relationship that exists on the level of simple goodwill, good faith, and social trust between the American people, so that we can repair the social fabric and stabilize our institutions regardless of the particular outcomes of any of these specific political questions. And that latter project winds up hinging on our ability to actively empathize, to actively engage, to create the context in which we can actually listen to each other and tone down the internal volatility enough to be able to say, okay, I've heard what you had to say. I hear where you're coming from. Now, since the space is here for it, let me return with my perspective. But to create the context for that to be genuinely and meaningfully reciprocal, so we can have the sort of, meaningful dialogue that you're pointing to. And I will admit that there is a tension between those two projects. I do not believe, though, that there is a contradiction between them, right?
Sure.
And obviously you're functioning in a space where you're, more head on, challenging these particular issues, whereas I'm more rooted in this civic sort of project. But ultimately I think that the success of my project has to allow for people to, in some sense, on each side of a question, sort of empower their ability to effectively engage with folks on the other side, because the corresponding fact is that we're also listening more effectively to one another, and therefore opening ourselves up to actually hearing, what is where the gem is in the poop, as you put it, so that, we can actually kind of evolve in a healthy sort of convergent kind of direction as a result.
I think the historical thing there is the diamond in the dunghill, but I may have hillbillied that up.
I was looking for it too, and I couldn't quite find it. But I'll say real quick that there are two ways not to see something. There's probably more than that, of course, but let's say there are two ways not to see something. One is to be too close to it, and the other is to be too far from it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that when we get into this question of lived experience versus, empirical reality, and, what's the basis upon which we should be, sort of anchoring our conversations and our policies, I mean, I think I see everything that you're seeing, and I'm, and am very much concerned about, these sorts of episodes. You're describing people losing their jobs for basically stating statistical facts and so forth. I mean, that's, I think that that's an untenable place for a society to be. But, the truth is there are two things of value that need to be, I think, kept within sight when we talk about the value and the relevance of lived experience. One is that just on that civic project level, if we're going to really be able to communicate with each other, it can't be the case that everybody needs to be held to the highest standard of empirical rigor, because actually that requires some training, as well as sort of some dispositional qualities that, some people have more of than others, regardless of race, right? I mean, even the conversation you and I have had, and I'm not saying either of us are that great at it, but I think we've done actually it wasn't too hard in this conversation, but
you're excellent.
Well, thank you, sir. But I mean, point being, the conversation we've had here today could have easily gone in a million terrible directions if we didn't more or less have a certain quality of that discipline. But you can't take that for granted if you're trying to bring people together in a meaningful way. You just can't. So, right. Appreciating the significance, even if subjective, of lived experience is necessary for that. But lived experience also can shine a light, and frequently does, on our material reality and the truer nature of it. Even when empirically rigorous minds fail to do so. And I've sort of already given an example of that in a sense. I didn't identify it that way, but when I made the point that, 1980s, Ronald Reagan, historic drop in the black unemployment rate, I had heard that claim made a million times. And it's true, given the way we calculate it. I remember, though, listening to a debate when I was younger between Larry Elder and Tavis Smiley. Larry Elder, black conservative radio show host here in LA. Tavis Smiley, liberal host on PBS, other networks, and so forth. And Larry was hitting Tavis with, these statistics. He said, look, black unemployment rate, historic drop in 1980, and in the 1980s under Reagan, salaries, earnings increasing. And Tavis said, look, Larry, he said, you just are not representing it correctly. He said, I remember the hell of those years. And Larry was like, what are you talking about? You remember the hell of those years? He said, you're giving me anecdotes. I'm giving you statistics. And at the time, I listened to Larry and I thought, well, Tavis, like, I need a little bit more from you, man. Like I feel the feeling, and yet I think now looking at it from another frame, like, I think I get what Tavis was really coming from. And he didn't quite, I don't think at the time, he didn't have the argument. But, what I recognize now is the fact that, what he and, what other black people more so were living at the time was seeing all their folks, seeing so many of our relatives and friends and whatnot, locked up. And that was happening at a rate that actually would have material implications for the stats that Larry was reciting, right?
Right.
But that is invisible in that conversation. And so, part of what I try and head off is the quickness with which we tend to want to dismiss, the perspectives that are on offer from the different sides. I mean, to me, it's kind of self-evidently dangerous to dismiss, empirical observations, right? In conversations over policy. I mean, that, it should be fairly clear why that's a non-starter. But there are also real reasons why you don't want to, out of hand, dismiss lived experience either, because what I think tended to find is that, when the emotion is strong, maybe it's based in nothing, but maybe it's based in something that's just failing to be articulated in a way that quite shows up in terms of its real significance in the context of a policy conversation, right, or something like that.
Sure.
And so, that's another reason why I think the civic project is important, and over the long run facilitates, the best versions of either a progressive or a conservative political project. And really in all of that, to me, that is the optimal outcome you get when you recapture the ethos of nonviolence and goodwill and love as a social value that King spearheaded and demonstrated, and wed that to the liberal project, because it brings heart to it, I think, in a way that doesn't require us to sacrifice our intellect, but does allow us to expand our capacity to actually know one another or hear one another, in a way that reaches further and further out across these widening cultural divides. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. It makes absolute sense. I fully agree that you're running into trouble, for example, especially when if you're willing to dismiss empirical evidence at a hand. You're also running into an error, however, if you think that your framing of complicated sociological data is necessarily going to be exactly right. And I also agree that the storytelling can shed light on new variables that need to be, like you said, maybe they're not being articulated right, especially if there's passion, but frustration often breeds passion, breeds emotion, etc. And so that's why, again, I advocate not listen and believe, as we often hear demanded of us, but rather listen and consider, listen, take seriously, listen and respect. What I worry about in that articulation is that it presupposes a liberal order. And I no longer presuppose that the liberal order is stable and guaranteed to be maintained. So my concerns and maybe my harder line arises because I am now genuinely afraid that the liberal order, you talk about long-term prospects. I'm genuinely afraid that the liberal order itself is likely to collapse. Unless what I've been I've been trying to find a name for what I think, and I've finally kind of hit on it in the last few days. I'm referring to a more steel-spined liberalism. So it does have to, I mean, I don't know how dorky do we want to get with metallurgy, but I'm into swords.
If you're going to metallurgy, man, we may have to pick this up in a
well, we'll keep it short. We'll keep it short.
Dialogue
when you make a sword or a knife or a blade or whatever, but especially like my favorite sword to train with, most people have never seen me do anything with it, is called a jian in Chinese. It's their longsword, Chinese longsword, and they're very famous. They're made out of spring steel. They're usually made out of two densities or two hardnesses of steel.
I've seen some of your sword play, by the way.
Well, one of the things that Jan is famous for is when it's really well made, you can actually bend it all the way down into a U shape, right? And let it. You could pull it over a pull-up bar or something and bend it down to a U, and then it'll go back without being deformed. It's that springy. Okay. So what you have to have when you make a blade like that, to get it to have that quality, it has to be hard to have and keep a sharp edge, but it has to be soft enough to bend and not shatter when you hit, say, if you hit somebody's armor or another blade. What you have to do is a process of annealing this. So you shape the steel, then you anneal the steel, then you temper the, you harden the steel and you temper the steel, and you have to go through this process. What you need is a steel that is very hard, so that it can retain a hard edge. That's called martensite for your metallurgists. And then it also has to be very soft and supple steel at the same time. And that's where I'm saying that we need a steel-spined liberalism. It has to be this highly refined steel that has that hardness to it. And yet I agree with you that we have to temper the steel as much as possible to restore that softness and springiness to the steel so it won't shatter and break by use of empathy. When you temper the sword, what you do is you actually heat it up, but not in a fire. You heat it in a much lower temperature. And that's kind of that friction of disagreeing dialogue where, as you described, that we're restraining ourselves. You and I I don't think you and I would flip out anyway because of our own temperaments, but certain people would. I mean, it'd be easy to think of two personalities we could stick on microphones right now who'd just be yelling at each other in a matter of moments.
Exactly.
And what you want enough to do that tempering. You want to keep that steel tempered. You want to have that flexibility. You want to have that empathy there, but you can't lose the character. Like if you make a sword that's just soft, it's not gonna hold an edge. If you hit another blade, it's just gonna dent or chip or deflect, bend, and become useless. And so you've got to find that sweet spot. And what I'm worried about is that if we don't get that steel right, all of the stuff we're talking about that presupposes the high functioning of a liberal order is at risk. And so I'm willing to for my part to be a little bit of yang to your yin, if you will, to be a little harder edge and to push bigger risks, and hopefully in the name of also giving people such as yourself a lot more room to have open dialogue. Somebody described me today, so they sent me a message and said that I'm like the mermaid carved on the front of a ship that has to take all the spray coming up and whatever else, and I kind of get that. It's not really fun. But I think that it's somebody I actually feel like has to do that to a degree, and it leaves room. And I hope that I can do it and here's the other thing. I think somebody will fill that role regardless. And I'd rather it be somebody, I hope, like myself, who I deem to be fairly reasonable and fair and open to this other aspect and truly want the liberal order and the liberal values to come through the far side, the small L liberal values to come through on the other side, as opposed to some reactionary demagogue who eventually will probably be able to take that mantle if no one else does. So my harder edge comes from a place of genuine concern that I feel, I've read Paul Bloom's book on empathy, against empathy, and I'm genuinely worried that, a too soft of an empathetic approach that's not intellectually empathetic, if you will, or strategically empathetic, is a manipulable approach as well. So I want to find that balance point, right, between listening and being taken advantage of.
Well, maybe that can be part of the subject of a follow-up conversation, James. I really enjoyed getting a chance to go deep with you. I think that we accomplished that. And I guess the one thing I would say is that we definitely don't presuppose the continuation of the liberal order and of our democratic republic and its core civic traditions. That is sort of why we're here in the first place, because certainly,
good.
Safeguarding the heart of that, I guess, the goodwill within which we're able to activate a mutual commitment to liberty, equality, justice, and the common good. There's got to be an engine for that. And I appreciate...
I feel you.
Yeah, man. And I appreciate you having participated with us in the past. I appreciate you being a guest on the podcast today. I hope that there are things that we can do in the future and that we can keep the conversation going. So
yeah, is anything I can continue to do to act as a breastplate to keep that heart beating, I'm happy to do.
yeah, man. Well, I appreciate it. I'm sure that I'll get plenty of suggestions in terms of things you can do. You know,
They'll tell me where I can stick it
after
I'm
this
sure.
conversation comes out. But the way I look at it is that we're all works in progress.
Of
And
course.
if humility has any value, it has to be in reminding us of that. So yeah, there are more things I want to talk about in an upcoming conversation. But in the meantime, I just want to say thank you. Thank you very much, James.
No, thank you very much too.
Absolutely. And for folks listening to us right now, if you are supportive of the work of Braver Angels, of the work of building a house united, there are a few things you can do. Go to braverangels.org, sign up, subscribe, join as a member. We've got folks, thousands of members across the country, organizing local communities, local chapters, college campuses. Like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Spread the word. Like I said, we are building a house united. Until next time.